Charlie or Charles?
Charlie.
Charlie Pepiton.
Pepiton with the long O.
Pepiton, okay, thank you. And you work at Gonzaga as a theater professor, and then you also are an artist outside of that. So I'm going to begin to bridge embodied cognition into our conversation, but I'm interested in you and what you do, what your passions are, and...
Yeah, I'm a director. So I started into this, into working in the theater like a lot of people do as an actor, but I quickly found that I can't turn off the voice that sees from the outside. So that's the directorial voice, is wanting to weave things together and bring things into a unity. So that's where I started to focus.
Yeah.
So where I got into embodied cognition is I realized that physically, as an actor, but also working with actors, physically, there was much more surprise than that limited psychological way in that most American theater trained actors use. You sort of run up against a wall more quickly, or it becomes very self-aware. But working physically creates more surprise. So I ran into it in graduate school. I had a mentor who worked very physically. She was from England and was trained that way. And so I just started becoming more and more interested in that. So whether I'm directing now on stage or screen, when I'm working with actors, it's almost exclusively physically first.
So when you say surprise, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think when actors work physically and they're really engaged in a task, then it's hard for the mind to overtake it. And there's hard for that split between, that artificial split between the body and the mind takes over, and it becomes extremely self-aware. But if the body is engaged, the mind can't help but go along with it. And so I think that creates surprise. And especially when you can start playing with things like physical contradictions and tensions that then surprise the actor into new emotions and all sorts of things that are then instantly in the moment, as opposed to being some sort of preconsidered false sort of thing.
So it's surprise, the actor's surprised.
Yeah.
Is that what you meant by surprise? It's just the actors being surprised, or other people are surprised?
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think both, because when actors are in, so a lot of the work that I do is based on third theater, sort of Jerzy Grotowski, Polish director, and Eugenio Barba's work, what they call the third theater. And so it's ensemble based, and it's putting actors in a situation where they're working or creating physical texts alongside a script. And so it makes the actor much more generative. They're not just enacting something from the page, they're in the process of creating something alongside. So physicality is co-equal with language, and that creates surprise, especially if it's not a one-to-one natural fit. So I'm working, where my head is right now is I'm working with a group of students at Gonzaga from all across the disciplines. It's a core integration seminar. And so I've got biology students and broadcasting students and sports science students. They're from everywhere. And we're working to adapt Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra into a new theatrical adaptation. And right now, they're very much between their ears. They're very much in their head. But we're about to make a turn where I'm starting to get them to activate these things that they're creating. And what I'm excited to see is how that breaks how much control they have over what they're thinking and how they're processing the material. Because almost always when the body gets engaged in the interpretation or the creation, it's harder to control. And so there's more surprise for the actor and then also for the audience.
So I like this idea of surprise, and I feel like doing a little bit more, talking a little more about it. Do you mean that surprise is an initial jumping off point, or do you like to keep surprise happening throughout the process?
Both.
Yeah.
Both if possible.
Yeah.
So I think, so Eugenio Barba has this idea of pre-expressivity. And so his point is that when he's training actors, he's trying to keep actors from processing too much of their reactions and always being sort of in the moment of engagement physically and with a partner. And at that point, we're acting out of a pre-expressive place. And so all of our assumptions, all of the things that we bring to the studio, all of those things are charged. And that's where we're working out of, as opposed to considering them, preparing them, evaluating them and censoring them. And that, because if we're working only out of expressive or out of a conscious sort of expression, it's so tightly controlled.
Yeah.
It's sort of like we're doing now, right? We're being very controlled and wordy and all these sort of things. And there's very limited range for what we're going to allow ourselves to do or say. And it can be good. It can be, we've all heard brilliant speakers, but it never quite gets to the heart of what that human wants to do.
This is interesting. So when I think of surprise, I map it kind of internally. So that big, you can see it in the face.
Yeah.
So the eyes, and there's a lift, and the mouth might open, and then internally, because I'm a singer, and I know actors can do this too.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, the soft palate's raising, and the larynx is lowering, and there's some expansion of the ribs and the abdominals and the pelvic floor, because I know that this instrument, all of these muscles work together to create that positioning, that posture of surprise. And I think of evaluating and analyzing as being minute, sometimes charged, but I call it sub-posturing. It's where the tongue and the vocal cords and the instrument is still it's still active, but it's subtle. It's like I'm whispering to myself. That's evaluation. It's like very subtle. But for a surprise, the instrument itself is expanding out of that minuscule activity.
And it happens faster than can be evaluated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I like that. So it sounds like, because I did some work with you and your students where there was a lot of movement and sometimes just interacting with people in ways that are different than what we do normally can start to evoke that surprise factor.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of an outside in.
It's totally outside in.
Yeah.
And in that, what you were a part of is a suite of techniques that in some ways is designed to have so many things going that an individual can't rely on pre-planning, right? And so in a way, I'm trying to deliberately flood the frame so that an individual has to let go of some control and then rely just on the rest of the ensemble. So that when it works and when an ensemble is trained together over time, they naturally will trust each other and can let go of that control. And so then all of that individual resistance to the work can fall away, and then a group can begin to work, and people start to forget whose idea is what, and where one idea forms, who owns the idea, and this is where we get into collective mind, right? So it's like an ensemble working physically can really come to some novel conclusions about things. And it starts with that physicality.
So what, I'm gonna cross, we're talking about embodiments and now I'm getting all looser. So what is one epiphany, like group, an example of a collective epiphany?
Well, this is where it almost always, it comes sometimes in contradiction. And so part of the way I work is as a director, when I'm devising new material with a group, we may create small physical etudes, just a little physical structure that can be repeated. And then we might set that against a text that wasn't a part of the generation of it. And it's somewhere in the dialectic collision between, you can imagine well, I'll give you an example. So a few years ago, I created a show at Gonzaga called Coming Home, a Soldier's Project. And it was devised from 10 years of interviews with veterans who had been in combat and had come back to study at Gonzaga. And so one of our psychology professors had been creating this 10-year trove of interviews. We took those interviews, broke it down, and then created a theatrical show from this oral history. And some of them were funny, and some were moving, some were heartrending. And so there's a passage of an interview where a student is describing having a flashback, a PTSD sort of triggering notion. He had been, if I'm remembering correctly, a bomb tech, and there was an explosion, and his ears were blown, and it sounded like water in his ears. And so we used this passage, this was the text, but we created this, there was a physical thing that we did where this character who was going to be speaking it, we were just carrying, I don't know, at some point we just created this physical mapping where this group swept in, took his legs out from underneath him, and then just sort of floated him. Mm-hmm. It's this beautiful thing. He's a really strapping, physical guy playing this. And we had these other men come in, and they came in very rigidly, and all of this was created outside of that text. They came in rigidly, swept his legs out from under him, and then it became really light when they floated him off. So in performance, what we did is we set this text. He's speaking this memory of this explosion to the oral historian. And as he's speaking, these men come in. And so we perform this physical thing alongside this text. And it's in the collision of things where the meaning is made. And so there's more, that scene ended up having more meaning and more resonance than just reading it or just performing the physicality alone. So there's a synthesis between those things.
Yeah. That sounds really beautiful.
It was a fun project. Yeah. It takes a long time to create that way. That's the thing. It's not efficient. It's not an efficient way to create, but there's more surprise in it. This is what we're talking about.
It sounds like a big part of that reason why it takes a long time is trust.
Yeah.
Building trust with the ensemble.
And building a way of working in a shared language. So there's always, working at a university, you're always building up the students, and then they graduate and you have to rebuild constantly. So there's this turnover. What you worked with this group of students in the fall, we were just at a stage where we could have, I think, fed into that matrix some sort of text or source material and started breaking it down. But that took, several sessions to build that trust.
Yeah. So what about starting from the inside out? Is that possible?
Of course.
Yeah?
Yeah, I don't like that as much because I think that's where when actors talk about the inside out, it's very much, this is like the American method, right? It's emotional recall, it's sense memory, those sort of things. And I think it's so much more limited, and it has a way of cutting actors off at the neck. And so you get a lot of facial acting.
Interesting. What about vocal and breath work?
Is that what you mean by internal?
This is more my.
That's different.
This is more my
thing.
wheelhouse. So, like movement. So with the voice, singing, and I'm opera trained, so you really have to access the entirety of the instrument and make weird sounds for years, at least for me, before I got a sense of everything. And then I could start to really shape it.
That's a different insight. So when I hear inside out, I think there's a Stanislavski, right? The Russian actor theorist who he changed Western acting, but inside out it became very analytical. Or this is the early Stanislavski, right?
Yes.
It's very analytical, psychoanalytical.
What
I
years?
think it's limited in that way, but.
I'm sorry, when was he alive?
Late 1800s.
Okay.
So 1875 and after, I think I'm forgetting the dates, I think he was born around 1875. He made his big movements around the turn of the century, and then the Russian Revolution sort of meant that he had to make money by publishing his writing, and so this is why we have them. Because he had to publish his writing, but which is good in a sense, because some of the best actors that we know of in the American tradition come from the disciples from Stanislavski. But like, Dustin Hoffman, Sally Field, and on and on and on. Everybody who came out of that tradition, it's extremely realistic acting. But where it goes wrong is it becomes way too much about what happens in the psyche or what happens in the mind. And so you get cut off from breath and movement and some of those things.
It gets cut off from the presumption of what the mind is, or I'm trying to say there's the presumption of what the mind is. And so people align themselves with that presumption. And then that comes with numbing or disconnecting
and I
the
think
rest of the body.
And Stanislavski sort of, that's his early period. His later period doesn't get as much airtime, but it was much more invested in physicality and breath and what he called psychological gesture. So these physicalities that are an outward sign of what's going on inside, which is much more invested in breath and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's a both and, but boy, the breath work that I like to use with actors is very much, you were talking about the expanding and contraction. I think that has a lot to do with opening actors and how actors, when we control the breath, we control the emotion. And when we control the emotion, it's not as true and raw. It comes out expressive as opposed to pre-expressive, right? It becomes censored and filtered. And so getting actors to open up and free their breath, even as much as sometimes when I can see that an actor is really locked, I can run them, get them out of breath, because if they can't control their breath, they're not able to control the emotion. And so that they find new levels.
Yeah. So singing, and maybe I'm curious if this is parallel to what you learned in acting. The idea is that what I do is I keep the ribs out to prevent the diaphragm, which is here, because it flattens on the inhale, to prevent the diaphragm from springing back up. Because I can't feel the diaphragm. I can't control it directly. So by keeping this out, the abdominals and sides and back, but primarily the abdominals, take over the regulation of the air. So now I have control, but it's prepared with a full movement. I call this whole thing the core. So it's prepared with full core movement. And I can still blend in emotional movements with that. And so it's efficient and strong and powerful. So I'm curious if that runs parallel to some of the acting.
Yeah, I think it does. I
training.
think there's so many crossovers. One, I think there's two different things. One is what an actor might do to build capacity, right? So just training of the mechanism to be able to fill a space. And theater professors everywhere are constantly saying, it's sort of like kids these days, they don't get the training. And we don't spend the time we should because of all sorts of reasons. We don't spend the time we should training students vocally. We go right to text work, text analysis, physical work maybe, and we somehow miss the point that the breath is where it all starts.
Text, yeah.
Right? It becomes analytical in our tradition. Our being the Western tradition.
And I'm curious about this because philosophically, I see this idea that at our foundations, we are text. At our foundations, we are language. Like, there's an assumption there that if we just reduced everything down, we would be language.
Yeah, I don't like that.
You're right. I don't either. I don't agree.
Yeah.
I think that we're first bodies and we're movement, and then language comes later.
Yeah.
So to come to the training, to the form, that makes a lot of sense to me. First, making sounds, and then forming those sounds and forming the emotion, and then the text can come into that.
There's a part of when I was in graduate school, I found this director, somewhat of a madman, named Edward Gordon Craig, he died in 1966, so he was active late 1800s through then. Okay. In England. He was the son of a very famous English actor. But one of his famous quotes is, I'm going to botch this, but the father of the dramatist is the dancer, not the writer.
Okay.
Something like that. And he says that the work of theater springs from action, movement, and dance. But if that's your assumption, it's the physicality, it's breath, it's movement, and how that then moves into language when it needs to. But if you come to the stage, or primarily the stage, not so much screen, thinking that the father of the dramatist is the poet, well, then you're prioritizing language. And I think most of the predominant assumption in this country, especially in England, especially, is that it's all poetry. And so prioritizing that kind of analytic text work comes first.
Yeah.
And we miss so much capacity building for breath and the body and what the body can express. And so that seems to be lacking.
That's really interesting because I'm relating that to analytic philosophy, which is primarily the United States and England, I think, and then continental philosophy, which is on the continent of Europe. And I'm imagining that there's a correspondence between that as far as what we value or how we think of ourselves. Interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know about that. I would be out of my depth in a hurry in that regard. But I know as phenomenology has grown and has taken over so many fields for the better, I think we get things like Merleau-Ponty's embodiment and the prioritization of what the body can know. And the body is a way of knowing. This is what I'm interested in. I know we share this.
Yeah.
What the body can tell us and what groups of bodies can tell us, and the way that if we use, for me, when I'm working with an ensemble of actors, I'm always pushing against this very analytical assumption. Even my collaborators, like I'm teaching with a wonderful philosopher this term who, our last project together was working with students to create a theatrical adaptation of Plato's Symposium.
Right.
And she was saying we need to be careful that our students weren't so comfortable with all of that physical work early. And I'm thinking, yeah, I know, but that's the main thing. I know they're not comfortable with it, and that's why we need to start there. And so I think I'm getting better at helping students who are clearly not in their body to find it in a way that is not scary. But that's not the assumption they come with. They come with the assumption thinking we have to think our way into performance, as opposed to that the body, that gives us tools as a way of thinking and making meaning, especially in groups. So it's a bit of a hurdle to overcome.
So do you see a shift that's happening, a change toward the body or away from the body? I mean, we're in a technological age, so
yeah.
What
I don't see it yet.
Yeah,
I would like to. I would
yeah.
like to say I do, but I think we're seeing being more and more cut off from, and it's not just cutting, when we cut ourselves off from the body, we're also cutting ourselves off from place and landscape, right? So we think of landscapes or even theater spaces, right, as a content for performance, as opposed to thinking of various places like your studio or the landscape outside as a medium for performance. Mm-hmm. And I think that all comes with getting cut off, as if place doesn't matter or our bodies don't matter, as if we shouldn't think about the way different bodies can create different meanings from similar source material. You know, I mean, a crude example is there's a wonderful American playwright named Charles Mee who has this wonderful treatise on casting, and he wants people to get rid of this idea of typecasting all alone. And he says, why wouldn't Romeo be in a wheelchair? Right? That mode of movement, the difference of abilities creates new possibilities for making meaning, as opposed to just assuming that the text can be channeled by bodies in a similar way. And so I think all of those things are connected. When we're cut off from the body and the particularity of our bodies and what our bodies give us, it's sort of flattening a lot of possibilities. So I don't see a lot of return. I know there are philosophers who are calling for that return, right? Richard Kearney wrote a wonderful book called Touch. I think he wrote it just pre-pandemic, and he had to revise it because it was coming out amid the pandemic when we were all becoming more and more cut off and put behind screens and all that kind of a thing. So he had to write it sort of an addendum to the whole book. But in that book, he uses the word anacarnation, which he takes to mean a return to the body. And he says the antidote for so much of what we're experiencing, some of our individual mental health problems and social problems, he ties to being cut off from bodies, where we're out of touch in a literal sense.
This is all good.
It's too much. It's
It
too much.
is.
The
Yeah.
hope of getting back in touch.
Yeah.
I think there's so many hurdles to it. That's why whenever I have that opportunity with a group of students, a group of actors, I think it's interesting to watch how instantly playful and how much joy there seems to be when people can get past that, the squeamishness of physicality at first.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. You said the word being in touch, and I liked this gesture, this movement, because it was skin, and so we talked about skin. And movement is muscular. And then my voice, my singing is also muscular. With singing, it's interesting, and with speaking, this is a mystery zone, I feel. There are structures in here that muscular structures are different than what we think of usually with muscles being like kind of long and attached to 2 points. The diaphragm is rounded and attached in many places, and it goes through the body, pelvic floor, the abdominals, they're crisscrossing all over the place. So they're different shapes, and so it's mysterious how this all works. And I like the idea of shining a light. What you find is raw, mortal, fleshy muscle. But then, as far as touch, what I think of next is that the musculature itself is sensory. That locationally I can feel the state of being in different areas internally, but also how it's positioned. So just like when we're moving around, I'm like, okay, my arms are here, my legs are here. I don't necessarily have to see it. I have this proprioceptive awareness of how they're oriented. And similarly, inside here, that's possible to varying degrees. Like I said, I can't feel the diaphragm, but I can feel the abdominals and other areas. And they're all connected together, kind of reflexively connected. So when I yawn, and it's not just here, it's like, whoa, it's all the way here. And these reflexes overtake us, like yawning or moaning, or and I think that accounts for some of the discomfort, because all of a sudden I'm in this state of being overtaken by this reflex movement.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's the whole thing. That's where the surprise comes, is when, and this what's a real joy is to watch groups of actors, ensembles begin to give into this. So when actors can give into shared impulses that neither or none of them in the ensemble are conscious of owning or initiating, then it really is about being taken over. And so I think that's the thing. I mean, you have to have a lot of trust to get to that point. But that's where the good stuff can be. And I think there's something to be said about contradiction too, where the good classic example is where part of the body is pulling down while the other part of the body is lifting up, right? And so there's this expansion that's happening. Yeah. But I think even with breath, we're thinking to breathe out even as we're sort of contracting an energy in, and that can give a certain sensation or a feeling. And so playing with contradiction is a way to get to a more pre-expressive place, because it's hard to maintain it, or it's hard to control it when your body is so forced on trying to maintain a certain contradiction in that way. And that opens people up to not being able to quite censor or control responses.
So what about a master at their craft, at acting or singing? Because you'll still allow some of that surprise or that release to everything, but at some point they know themselves. I mean, they got this, they got this thing under control. I think back, I just said under control, and I didn't like that, but they can move well, like ride the environment, themselves, the whole situation, and it just becomes this beautiful dance. So do you feel like that is a goal?
Well, so one of the things that I always try to practice as a director is asking more than is possible. And so even a master is not able to do something. So when I directed The Tempest one time, Shakespeare's The Tempest, and I gave the actor who was playing Ariel the task that by the end of the process I wanted her to fly, to move so lightly on her feet that she flew, where she wouldn't even leave footprints. We're working outside. Well, that's impossible, right? But I think there's so much involved in trying to accomplish that, even though it's a complete impossibility that the actor can keep striving for it. So I like to try to find contradictions that are impossible to maintain, or physical goals that I mean, the actor's never going to fly, but by the end of the process, she was super light, and the way her movement had to accommodate that suggestion, it was close. And I think so Barba calls this a knot. So I'm really influenced by him, where he'll give a task to an actor which is very clearly impossible or nearly. I saw Julia Varley is somebody that is a member of the Odin Theater that he works with. And she was giving a performance demonstration of this. And one of the knots that he gave her is to tell the story of the Minotaur using only the word Minotaur and a physicality. And it was an exercise. And it's something that she continually works on. But when she performed it, you see the story of this Minotaur escaping this maze. And it's just this beautiful physicality. And it's not a piece that's necessarily for performance. It's a piece that's about actor training.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of it's like a koan, right? And so even Julia Varley is one of the master actors of our time, I think. And so to see her to perform that, she's still working to perfect it.
I want to take back the word goal, because I like what you said. Yeah, so not something that you attain and then all of a sudden I'm here at the peak of the mountain kind of metaphor, but more like, there's a continual movement that's happening, and we change as human beings over time.
Totally, yeah.
So you can't really make anything a goal where you just stop. All right, so embodied cognition. It's primarily emerging in philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology. So fairly heady.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, talking
disciplines.
about it
Yeah.
is a little like dancing about taxes, you know? Talking about embodied cognition, it sort of misses something.
Yeah, and so I'm still bridging into it as a performer and getting to know the vocabulary. And I taught with it. So there's this merging of vocabulary, of people coming at this idea that the mind is embodied from different places. So like Evan Thompson comes at it from phenomenology, cognitive science, and Buddhism. So in Buddhism, there is internal sensation connecting, or one is connecting to internal sensations, primarily the breath. And he talks about having done a Vipassana meditation retreat. Are you familiar with that? So 10 days of meditation, silent, and you're focusing on the breath. So there's this focus on a very simple movement. The body, the core, wants to move in different ways because we're movers. And the idea is that we continue to calm that. So if I take that into acting or singing, bridging embodied cognition, this idea that the mind is embodied, we are moving. I mean, there are moments of quiet. There are moments when we can just be breath, movement. But I think that a point of view, I think that you would share this, is that we do move. We do emote. That's part of who we are as,
there's no
as
real
human
stillness.
beings. Yeah, there's no real. Whereas some of the philosophical assumptions that I've seen in Buddhism, or maybe Buddhist modernism, which is how Evan Thompson talks about like a current state of Buddhism in the United States or in the Western world. It's this kind of blending of modernism and Buddhism. is that there's an assumption that the mind is still kind of Cartesian, split from the body, and there can be an attainment of a peace. And that is the goal. That's the Zen place. But what that does, or what that can do, is kind of put things on a hierarchy where this is the highest realm, and anything below this, and similarly the way that Descartes thought emotions are irrelevant they're irrelevant to the project of looking at the world and the body as a neutral object to be studied empirically. So yeah, embodied cognition is interesting because I'm wondering if it's still holding assumptions that we are this floating Cartesian consciousness in a body. And I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm quickly out of my depth in regard to those. I mean, I'm a meditator, and so I understand what, just from my own experience, what those things can do. My understanding of those things is that this consciousness that we might flirt with, if never quite attain during meditation, is the underlying. It's less the highest form as opposed to the underlying structure. And so all of that physicality comes out, all of our physicality, the way we inhabit interactions, the way that we understand or smell or we think with our bodies, comes as an expression of that underlying consciousness. So it's the foundation for all the other. And I think that's a big difference, as opposed to trying to attain that. The more we're aware of that underlying stillness, consciousness that's sort of pre-reflective, and the more we strengthen our connection with that, the better that we can jump off of it as a platform. So for example, what does this look like in acting, right? I think when I'm working with ensembles, the best place I can get actors to, it has to start with if stillness is impossible because we're always moving, as close to stillness as possible, and readiness for anything to happen. And so there's an alert readiness. You think of, like in yoga, the mountain pose, right? With your palms open, your eyes open, everything relaxed, and you're sort of ready for action and open to impulse in that way, as opposed to being on guard and in control, right? And so meditation and yoga is one way to that with actors. It's a way of getting rid of unwanted tensions that might prevent a certain kind of movement, and also movement between actors and the sort of embodied way of knowing between bodies. If I've got tension in my neck, if I've got tension that's limiting my movement, it's actually limiting the way my body can think. Right? It's an old trick of an actor to create anxiety and nervousness just by putting your body in a position that is anxious.
Right.
And so then you're telling your body, your body is telling itself, something's not right, I'm out of balance. And so it's not unusual to feel that.
So let's map that, if you don't mind. Like, what's anxiety? Where?
Oh gosh, we started this
it.
interview, right? And naturally there's a camera on, and so I was anxious. The more I could breathe. Now we're just having a conversation, right? But I think when I started, it was like this, right? This is
me too.
There was this, so I think the shape of anxiety, our bodies, we create this feedback loop.
Yeah.
And so if I were to breathe very shallowly and to put my body into a knot off balance, then it's very difficult not to feel that. And what's the difference between feeling it and actually having it be present?
Yeah.
Right? It's creating actual anxiety. So, go back to what we were saying before. We are living in a time of chronic anxiety. I don't think that's unconnected with being outside of our bodies.
Yeah. So I like that. The legs crossed, maybe like arms.
Yeah, it's defensive
Yeah,
right
like
now.
that.
I'm trying to not because I
Right.
already put myself into that.
Right? So, and then I'm wanting to go internally, like, okay, if I'm anxious, there's a contraction that I might have. I'm posturing right now, like some contraction in the abdominals that stops the breath. There's a feeling of contraction or weight, like in the solar plexus area, maybe in the chest, maybe the neck, the throat's a little contracted, maybe the back of the tongue's contracted. The core of anxiety, as far as where I feel it, I think is here.
Yeah,
It's
I'd
about,
agree with that.
because I could possibly be moving, breathing, expanding, and still have my legs crossed. I could
Sure.
still be open. This gets back to the outside in and inside out.
Yeah, I
thing.
learned
Yeah.
something from you. I don't know if you remember this, but we were having a conversation with Charlie Lassiter
Yeah.
at Gonzaga, for listeners, philosopher at Gonzaga.
Yes, yeah.
We were in his office, and here we were, Charlie and Charlie, two
Yeah.
men, constantly talking about external. And you
Yeah.
said, it's interesting. Do you remember what you said?
I do, yeah.
What did
well,
you say?
actually, I don't remember exactly what I
So-
said, but yes, I think I know you're going.
Well, you made a point that I think men tend to be less the interiority
Yeah.
is a complete foreign thing to men. And women have, I think, a greater understanding of the interiority. And so, anyway, that's given me a lot to think about. I think that's true. I remember being in the birthing suite when my son was born and watching this whole process take place. And there's this amazing embodied moment and this sense of interiority, which I think is a very rare thing in contemporary life. So when I think of the outside and letting it in, that's the more natural way for me to think about it. But
Yeah.
see, people listen. I've been chewing on that since you said
That's
it.
awesome. Yeah. Yeah, well, then it's taken me a while to develop that within myself because I started and spent years of my developing life being cut off. And it was when I started to sing that I began to break that down. And that was 4 years. I did 3 years of pre-med in college and took a year off,
okay.
and then I came back in music and did 3 more years. So I started singing as a senior in college, having taken a leap into something I didn't know what was going to happen, but I just felt that I needed to do something to address health and dissociation and other things. So it's taken me a while, and part of that process, I don't have children, but even just the menstrual cycle and knowing hormonally, but then also muscularly, what is happening, what's going to be happening. I check in often with that cycle. Ovulation, there's like a week or 2 where you're feeling good, and I connect that to projects that I'm doing. If I just get past ovulation, there's a dip in hormones, and I'm not feeling very good, I'll check in just to give us some context, some perspective. And then 3rd week is progesterone, when the body is preparing for pregnancy, so I'm sleepy. It's actually my least favorite time. I just feel very tired. And then the last week before menstruation is the hormones drop. And so you're a little more sharp, but still alert. I'm more alert than my week 3. And then the menses begin, and then there's cramping. So there's all of this internal
See how the body is then giving you insight into how to think about time, in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, that is essentially an embodied cognitive process.
Yeah.
So we've got 5 senses that are most common, but I think there are other ways of knowing, and there are ways of being in contact
Yeah.
physically, that are really, really primitive ways of knowing that modern life is cutting us off from. And I think that's what I'm interested in. Working with actors, I'm always interested in how to get them more connected with those older ways.
Yeah.
And it comes back to surprise, because it's surprising, I think, the way that I like to work outside as much as possible with actors, because of the way that landscape and objects and textures can create different possibilities.
Yeah.
But that's external, so it's interesting.
No judgment.
Yeah, no judgment, but certainly different, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, yeah, and there's wisdom
Mm-hmm.
to the outside in, and I think there's wisdom to the inside out, and the synthesis of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think culturally, societally, the outside in, the movement, the interaction predominates. So that's my work, is trying to bring more perspective of embodied cognition having to do with basically this area
Mm-hmm.
right here, and bringing some vocabulary to it, but also some visualization to it, because this is easy to see,
Yeah.
but this isn't.
You
It's a
would-
small movement, but it's huge,
Yeah.
because this is what we are.
There's a Greek director who's, I couldn't begin to spell the last name, but Trizopoulos is his name.
Okay.
And he's doing a lot of work with breath.
Yeah.
And so his work is very much breath specific, and trying to think about breathing not just as a lung
Yeah.
operation, but as a whole body operation, and how that can then empower actors for greater capacity for voice, but also for the impulse to respond.
Yeah.
And so a lot of his work is, and I've just been introduced to this not long ago by a friend of mine, who's very much an embodied performer. And she's found it to be really empowering. And her voice has grown. There's more capacity, more breath control in this, but you can feel resonance of her voice far beyond the normal resonating centers, because she's expanded that as well. So I think the possibilities for what the body can do are so much more interesting than when we don't separate that body and the mind.
Yeah.
And we think of them as a unit.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Anything else that you'd like to
I don't
say?
think so.
Okay. This is
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for doing it.
Yeah.